Okay, so welcome to our closing address, which will be given by esteemed historian Rob Citino, who is the National World War II Museum's Samuel Murray Stone Senior Historian and the newly appointed Executive Director of its Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
Perfect. I can't even say that.
Well, and the rest of it I just plagiarized from the website, so I'm just disclaimer. He's an award-winning military historian and scholar who has published 10 books, including The Weimar Retreats, Fighting a Lost War, 1943, Death of the Wehrmacht, The German Campaigns of 1942, and The German Way of War from the 30 Years' War to the Third Reich, and numerous articles covering World War II and the 20th century military history. He speaks widely and contributes regularly to general readership magazines such as World War II. Dr. Citino enjoys close ties. I can't believe I'm saying Dr. Citino. It's been Rob for how many years? Close ties with the U.S. military establishment and has taught 1 year at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and 2 years at the U.S. Army War College. The title of his talk is The Accomplices, Hitler's Officer Corps at War. Please join me in welcoming Rob Citino.
You know, we've been making a lot of jokes, we all have, about who's staring over your shoulder, but I think I win the I win the award. Whoa, who let him in here? It's really been a wonderful day today. Starting yesterday, but today's workshop has really been great. Got to see old friends, people I've known for a while, like Katrin and Cam Zinzo, my student from University of North Texas. My oldest friend of all, Colin Dams, I've met for the first time today, but we've been Facebooking back and forth because we like the same kind of music. So met a lot of Jadwiga, a new friend, and Robert, and I don't want to leave anybody out, so I don't want to mention, but really good papers and wonderful work. You know, it strikes me that the World War I historical community, Jonathan and I were talking a bit about this, they've really established a sense of solidarity over the last interminable 4 years of non-stop anniversaries. And I give them credit. They really have, they've taken advantage of that. I think World War II history right now, the community is in a bit more diffuse state, and maybe doing things like we're doing, like this new Second World War Research Group, North America, is really going to help that. And I, for one, want to take part in that. I know the museum where I work wants to take part in that, and I hope you all do too, because this has been fun, and when it's fun, that means we should do it again, you know, ASAP. So. Earlier we were talking about, when the graduate students were asking us questions, we were talking about that sort of, I don't know, that border between personalism and structuralism, and how much personality, how much of history is driven by individual actions, and how much is driven by more structural concerns. And of course, this is, the man behind me is kind of the classic example. And I really am interested in how responsible, and how much Hitler was responsible for World War II. I know that sounds crazy. I don't mean who started it, because I think he had a lot to do with that. But I was in Cameron's U.S. history class today, and, you know, explaining the origins of World War I. You got the Archduke, and you got the Serbs, and you have the Black Hand, and it goes on and on and on, and it is a solid day of lecture. But explaining the origins of World War II has always been, at least in Europe, has always been Hitler. Then we're done. And I never really thought that was a satisfying answer, but the more I study World War II, especially the way the Germans fought it, I think it's less and less of a satisfying answer as to how much Hitler did in World War II. And so let me start with sort of the thesis of my talk. And the thesis of my talk, which is explicated in 650 beautiful pages of the Wehrmacht's Last Stand, is that Hitler, you know, didn't do it all by himself. The man behind me did not do it all by himself. And by it, I mean, of course, fighting and losing World War II. By he, of course, I mean the Führer, the leader of Nazi Germany, you know, the man looming on the screen behind me. Standing behind him, alongside him, with him, every step of the way, was a corps of highly trained professionals. I'm most interested in Army officers. I know, Con, in the back row there, we want to be joint, and we want to talk about Army, Navy, and Air Force. For the Germans, of course, the major service, by far the largest of the services, the largest in terms of manpower, by far the lion's share of the funding was the Army. So I tend to focus on Army officers. And I think the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine officers are probably pretty similar in their own stance. But standing alongside Hitler was a corps of highly trained professionals, army officers especially. What to call them? If World War II was a crime, they were accessories before, during, and in many cases after the fact as well. They supported Hitler's launch of the war in 1939. They worked tirelessly to put his military operational ideas into action, that is to actualize Hitler's military concepts. They remained fiercely loyal to Hitler to the very end. Oh, certainly, we can find individuals, and I promise I'll call them out by name in the course of this talk. We can find individuals who broke with Hitler in various ways, and some in quite dramatic ways. But as a corporate body, and that's how I'm looking at the Army Officer Corps right now, as a corporate body, they stayed with him, fiercely loyal to the very end. And then, after the end of the war, virtually all of them in one way or another turned around and denied that they had done any of the things I just attributed to them. And so if I can describe, my book, the current book, The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, in one sentence, I'll return to the one I began with, and it's that he did not do all this by himself. And in fact, And in fact, fighting a modern war all by yourself is simply ridiculous. If you look at the scale and scope of World War II, virtually every corner of the globe, massive military operations going on every day, some of the greatest battles in human history barely noticed in World War II. They just don't rise to the level of the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad, and so we barely notice them. Cameron, under me at University of North Texas, wrote a very fine MA thesis on Operation Anvil / Dragoon, the landing in the south of France. Any other war in human history, this would be the big show. But again, it gets, as Cameron and I have observed, because we went through all the single volume histories, it gets a paragraph or a half paragraph in most standard histories of World War II. So it's impossible. Of course, it's ridiculous on its face that one man could be blamed for all that or ascribed all that to himself. But he didn't do it all by himself, and that's a fact I'm going to try to establish in the course of this talk today. Now, it's a sad fact, but when the generals said these things, by these things I mean that, we were against him, we didn't like the way he ate his peas. He slurped his soup. He was rude. He was crude. We didn't like the way he behaved. We didn't like what he did to the communists. We didn't like what he did to the various ethnic and racial minorities. We hated what he did to the Jews. We didn't want World War II. When they said these things, we as a corporate body, let's talk about the historians in America, or perhaps in the English-speaking West. We, as a corporate body, we tended to believe them when they said those things. I received my PhD in 1984, and I can certainly tell you how World War II was being taught in the American Academy from the late 70s on to the mid-80s, and then for some time thereafter. We tended to believe them. German generals were men of breeding, wealth, taste, old families, culture. They were often from some of the oldest Junker dynasties, the land-holding nobility, and especially east of the Elbe River, the Prussian heartland. They were often scions of these old families, and the names of the German officer corps in World War II reads like the names of Frederick the Great's officer corps in the 7 Years' War. It's the same families, the Seydlitzes, I don't even want to belabor the point, the Mansteins, and a lot of others. Many of them, not all, but many of them were quite gifted commanders. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Some of them may actually deserve the overused moniker of military genius. Military historians, again, card-carrying member of the tribe. You're a general, you walk and chew gum at the same time, somebody's going to call you a genius. But some of the German generals, I think you could probably make a case for a certain level of operational acumen, I guess. So here's a famous name and a famous face. I guess I will step out every now and then. General Heinz Guderian, there he is, looking confident and sharp. This is at the height of the French campaign, when he had every right to be looking confident, when the French army was falling apart all around him, and his panzers, his tank formations, were driving to the English Channel. He claimed, and one could make a case, one could argue there on the details, he had practically invented modern mechanized warfare with tanks and aircraft working in close cooperation. The outside world called it blitzkrieg, right? Lightning war. The Germans themselves never really used that term, but Calling Guderian the father of Blitzkrieg practically became a trope in Western historiographical circles in the 1970s, 80s. Still shows up. I've spent a lifetime kind of puncture that balloon, explode that myth a little bit, and it's had absolutely zero impact. It's humbling. I think about that. I think about that a lot. Another famous. Oh, there we go. Another famous face, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He may be the most famous German general of the 20th century, and maybe one of the most famous generals of all time. A German general, but Hollywood makes a movie or a series of movies about you, and you know you've hit the big time. Rommel may have been one of the boldest, most aggressive operational commanders of all time. He had that uncanny sense of timing. Coolly awaiting the precise moment when his opponents were most vulnerable and off balance, and then launching a great attack or counter stroke of his own. I taught for a couple of years, I think you heard in the intro, at the U.S. Army War College, and I remember the happy moment I got to write the German word Fingerspitzengefühl on the board. And I had a couple of U.S. Army officers, men who'd been in the uniform for nearly 2 decades, who said, now you're just making words up. But I'm not making that one up. Fingerspitzengefühl is that fingertip, that tingly feeling you get in the tips of your fingers when you think you're ready to strike. It's sort of a sense of military intuition. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, there he is. He held off massive Soviet forces in the East for 2 full years with a hopelessly inferior force numerically, but in some sense also qualitatively. Those years from 42, 44 is when the worm really turned on the Eastern Front. Whatever fantasies you have about the Wehrmacht in 1942, they were completely dead by 44. But Manstein managed to hold that front together when perhaps we might say few others could have. His characteristic move was to swiftly redeploy his forces from one flank of a particular sector to the other. So the Soviets are rushing forward, and it looks like all is lost, and Manstein would coolly rearrange the reserves from one flank to the other and catch the Soviets sort of napping, and then launch again a great counterstroke. He called it rochada, a castling maneuver. Fan of chess. So you know what you do with, you move your king and your rook, and suddenly, instead of being tucked in the corner, the rook has been brought out for offensive action in chess. Manstein really kind of saw war as a sort of a fantastic chess game. All these commanders published their memoirs. Rommel's were published posthumously as Krieg ohne Hass, War Without Hate. But Guderian, of course, famously published Panzer Leader. Manstein famously published Lost Victories, and so many others besides. Mellenthin with his book Panzer Battles. So you see that if you put Panzer in the title of a book, you ought to increase sales 42%. I'm not sure exactly what's happening there. I've used Blitzkrieg a lot, and even if I don't want to, my publishers have put Blitzkrieg into the title of a lot of my books. And someday I'm going to write a book of love sonnets. It's going to be great love sonnets of Blitzkrieg, isn't it? Cookbook. I have a lot of thoughts on that. So if you have any thoughts on that, please share them with me. But all these commanders published their memoirs, again, often with Blitzkrieg or Panzer, German term for armor, in the title. And they all pretty much said the same thing. They'd hated Hitler. They'd been against his war from the start. But they did their duty. If only he'd left them alone, they all claimed, they would have won the war. Or at least achieved some kind of what Manstein called a Remisfrieden, a stalemate peace. There's the language of chess again. You have castling and stalemates. Remember, Manstein loved chess. And if you read his memoirs, you'll see that you get chess references everywhere. Finally, and here we're into the most problematic area. They played ignorance of the horrific crimes that Germany had committed in the course of the war. They'd fought a good fight, a good war, they said. They boasted that the Wehrmacht, the armed forces, had emerged from the struggle with clean hands, with what many of the generals called clean hands. They acknowledged they didn't deny mass murders had taken place. They sometimes cut down their numbers, but they didn't deny they'd taken place. But they assigned blame for those mass murderers to the thugs in the Nazi Party, these despicable non-military types, and especially the SS. So the SS was once called by a very fine historian, Gerhard Reitlinger, the alibi of the German army. Now, the point he's making is that the German army was able to say, we didn't do it, the SS did it. The SS was labeled a criminal organization at Nuremberg in the way that the German army was not labeled a criminal organization. It's probably pretty important to rehabilitating German militarism just enough to make them our ally, West Germany at least, to make them our ally in the Cold War. I should make some distinctions. I'm perhaps being a bit more unfair to Rommel. Rommel fought in North Africa, by and large, where large-scale atrocities did not take place. He fought in an unusual theater. I believe completely that if you take Rommel and you throw him into the Eastern Front in late 1942 or early 1943, he'd behave very much like the other German generals. I find it, well, he would have been unable not to behave like the other German generals. Say the same thing about Kesselring in Italy. He did dip his toe into the atrocity waters, most definitely, but it would have been a lot worse had he been on the Eastern Front. Then it would have been tens and hundreds of thousands instead of thousands or tens of thousands, as he was responsible for in Italy. So, clean hands, we could have won the war, we could have had a stalemate. If only Hitler, this vulgar and uncouth corporal, as he's always labeled, lance corporal would be more technically correct, but only if this uncouth lance corporal who had listened to us, you know, we the German officer corps, we have been drinking of the waters of Clausewitz and the other great German theory, and Moltke and von Seeckt in the interwar period for so long. Naturally, we were geniuses. By and large, Western historiography backed that up. Check out the names of books on the German army sometimes, you know, the devil's virtuosos. It's like that. Sometimes they played pretty off-key in the course of World War II, but apparently they were virtuosos. A genius for war. Trevor Dupuy's famous book on the German army, A Genius for War. So we tended to believe them. Clean hands and great commanders. Now, there's just one problem, and I think everybody in this room probably already knows what it is. I don't think I'm really being very, I'm not really hiding the point I'm trying to make. All the claims of the German officer corps about their behavior and their attitudes in World War II are false. I mean, I think it's tough to say the documentary record is clear on anything. I've been a historian long enough to know that that's always a kind of a fraught thing to say. But if the documentary record can be said to be clear about anything, it can be said to be clear on this. The officer corps backed Hitler's rearmament schemes in the 1930s. They knew what it meant. A disarmed Germany meant no career path for any of them. A German army which had just doubled, trebled, quintupled, octupled its size was going to mean promotions, wealth, fame, careers for all of them. And they backed Hitler's rearmament schemes in the 30s for career reasons and also because they shared a lot in common with Hitler's belief about racial struggle and Hitler's belief about the nefarious role that the Jews had been playing in German life. Whatever they said later, they backed him to a man on those points. They supported the invasion of Poland in 1939. There's very few objections to the invasion of Poland in 1939, and likewise the expansion of the war to the west in 1940. They didn't make a peep when Hitler invaded the Balkans, and they said nothing when Hitler invaded the USSR. When I say Hitler invaded, Hitler gave the orders for the invasion of the USSR in Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. They were as certain as he was that they'd be victorious in a few months. And I think, again, the documentary record on this is pretty clear. Even as the war slowed down and then turned bad and then turned completely hopeless, so we're looking at the 41, 42, 43 nexus, I would say, even as the war turned hopeless, they followed Hitler's orders to hold on, to fight on, to stay in the field no matter what it took. Hitler was fond of giving an order and telling his men to hold out no matter what the cost. Halten jeden Preis is a phrase you'll read again and again and again. In the documentary record, in the memoirs of the German officer corps, in Hitler's speeches, he told them to fight until 5 minutes past midnight. if that's what it took. And they were willing to do that. University Press of Kansas has been my publisher for the last 6 books, and they've done wonderful work. I love the University Press of Kansas. But I came to them and said, I want to call this new book 5 Minutes After Midnight, and they just all looked at me like I just fell off a turnip truck. I mean, who's going to buy that? What does that mean? So it became the Wehrmacht's last stand, but it could have been 5 minutes past midnight. It's a phrase that Hitler used constantly. We'll have reason to return to that in a moment. Now, once again, to return to the most problematic and clearly the most fraught area, despite their claims, they were up to their eyeballs in atrocities. They placed their men, their equipment, their administrative talents at the disposal of the killing squads in the East. The Holocaust could not have taken place, could not have happened without their administrative and logistical support. And very often, they're men doing the actual shooting. If there happened to be an Einsatzgruppe in the area, one of these action teams, the 4 battalions that the Germans formed in 1941 for mass shootings, well, the Einsatzgruppe would probably carry out the shootings. But if not, regular soldiers can be pressed. Anyone holding a rifle can kill civilians. And German soldiers killed civilians in great numbers. Army soldiers, now not Waffen-SS or these other irregular, semi-irregular formations, but honest to God, army soldiers. The Holocaust could not have happened without them. Even as defeat became certain, and they could see the writing on the wall. I mean, they were professionals after all. You'd have to be on crack in 1944 to say, we're going to pull this one out. Last second, there's going to be some dramatic reversal of fortune. You would have to be completely divorced from reality, and I really, by and large, don't think these men were divorced from reality. Even after defeat became certain, and they could see the writing on the wall, they said so often enough, and they were professionals after all, they kept going. They groused about it in private. They groused about Hitler in private. As we all grouse about our bosses, I suppose, in private. But they obeyed their orders. And what they wound up doing in the especially last 12 months of the war, so the mid-44 to the end of the war in 45, end of the war in Europe, what they did in that 12-month period was to launch their outclassed Lancers, the German word for sort of G.I. Joe, the ground pounder. Lancer became the term in World War II. They launched their outclassed Lancers into one hopeless battle after the other, getting millions of their own men killed for no reason at all in the last year of the war. Now, as I'm sure most people in this room know, let's see if, there we go. There was an attempt within the officer corps to kill Hitler. You've seen the film Valkyrie, since someone mentioned Empire of the Sun earlier. It's a blast from the past. Yeah, well, I'll throw Valkyrie into the mix. There was a plot within the officer corps to kill Hitler. A plot did arise amongst German officers to get rid of the Fuhrer. They even succeeded in placing a bomb in his headquarters on July 20th, 1944, the famous bomb plot of July 1944. But the conspirators, and there is the lead conspirator, Klaus von Stauffenberg, the conspirators were colonels, by the way. Or by and large, I should say, were colonels. It was a revolt, in other words, not of senior staff, but what I would call, I don't know, is middle management appropriate? I suppose we could seek the appropriate or perfect metaphor. But it was middle managers, not senior staff, men perhaps who were officers who were a bit closer to their men. Hard to say, but it definitely was not a revolt of the senior staff. And men like Stauffenberg worked overtime to recruit generals. They were all approached. Rommel was approached in an oblique fashion. Nobody said, we're going to blow Hitler away. But they said there may be a change of regime, and would you be interested in being the new leader of Germany? And he said, well, you think about it. Then he kind of dropped out. They talked to Guderian. They went up and down the chain of command, desperately trying to recruit several generals for this. Gunther Kluge, who was OB West, so he was the high commander in the West at a time when the Western Front was falling apart. They went to him, and he talked to them for 3 hours. It was a 3-hour conversation, and nothing was oblique about it. And, he was urged, and finally one of the conspirators said, a great man would seize this opportunity for Germany. And Kluge uttered, I think, his own epitaph, and maybe the epitaph of the entire officer corps. Sadly, Kluge, he said about himself, talking about himself in the third person, sadly, Kluge is not a great man. So they tried to get a general or several of them, but it's very, very difficult. So A question I've really tried to answer. I was writing a book in 2007. It turned into The Death of the Wehrmacht, the German campaigns in 1942. I wanted that to be the whole end of the war, 42, 43. I was going to do it. And then it just turned into a trilogy. You know, the way you take a deep dive, and then you go down your personal rabbit holes, and by the next thing you know, you've written 3 books where you intended to write 1. But one question I've had to really deal with is, why did the German officer corps stay loyal, even after defeat was certain? And what I think I'd like to do, I'm just kind of following my time here, I think we're all good. What I'd like to do is give you what I think are 4 reasons that have been brought forward, have been adduced as the reason that the officer corps stayed loyal. And I think each of them bears some examination. I'm not rejecting them as absolutely false either. I think each of them probably contains at least a grain of truth, but I think one of them is crucial. Certainly, one factor that kept the German army in the field, the German officers in the field late in the war, was their fear of Soviet revenge if and when the Red Army broke into Germany. I mean, they knew exactly what they had done in the Soviet Union, recalled, was whatever they might have said later. They knew exactly what they and their troops had done in the Soviet Union. That's the mass killing of civilians from the beginning of the campaign to the end. They had good reason to be worried, in other words, on that point. And frankly, Soviet troops lived up to those fears and expectations. They behaved atrociously on German soil when they broke into the country, killing and looting and mass rapes of every German woman that they could get their hands on of any age. It's a horrible story. The Soviets may have lost the Cold War in the first week after the occupation of Berlin in terms of what Western propaganda was able to make out of the behavior of their troops. I can't tell you, since I've been studying this for a long time, I can't tell you what used to be, the crazy things that used to be said about this subject. Let's say the rape of Berlin, since we had the rape of Nanjing earlier. Well, you know, that most of these troops were not frontline fighters. They were supply troops. Apparently, supply troops they're the worst. There were a large number of Asians in the ranks of the Soviets. Apparently, that's the real problem. You know, it was up and down all over the Soviet force, and in fact, it's impossible to say those kind of things, and even saying them out loud seems kind of silly, and they would be silly if they weren't taken so seriously back in the 70s and 80s. So that's one, you know, the fear of the Red Army. I think everybody, you know, the Red Army's no longer with us. I still have nightmares about it, so everyone should fear the Red Army. I think it's good. Now, a second factor often brought forward was what happened at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. There, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill announced that the Allies were fighting for nothing less than Germany's unconditional surrender. There seemed to be no alternative, German generals were able to argue, but to fight on until the bitter end. Nobody demands unconditional surrender. I mean, I've studied war my whole life, and I can't count on the fingers of one hand the number of states that have ever said, we're fighting until unconditional surrender. The Romans said all kinds of things about their wars with Carthage that we now know are kind of specious. Those wars went on for centuries, so it's a funny kind of unconditional surrender. But the generals were able to claim that they could fight on to the bitter end. And I could argue with that. I think the unconditional surrender declaration was important in keeping the Allied coalition together. And there's a reason it was done. It's important in keeping Stalin on board. So there's not going to be any kind of separate negotiations. It was also a good sign to the German resistance. There was not going to be a post-war Hitler. There's not going to be a Hitler regime to deal with. There'd be problems, but there wouldn't be that problem. The Hitler problem was going to be dealt with. So that's two. And again, if Gerhard Weinberg in the room, we'd have a loud argument about whether unconditional surrender prolonged the war. He doesn't think it did, but we could go back and forth. But I think it's at least a plausible case. What do we say? Prima facie case, right? That first glance case looks like a good one. Something else to remember that is almost always forgotten, and here we owe Gerhard Weinberg, I think, for first, bringing this fact forward. Let's remember something else. Hitler was also bribing his top generals to the hilt. He was providing them with what we usually say in English, the German word is Dotationen, so we translate it not as donations, but dotations. It's an old Prussian word for an award from the king from a grateful king to a subject who has done meritorious service for the state. So Frederick the Great gave his generals dotations. So I have now written 10 books, and I probably said dotations in 7 of them, and the copy editors bring it back and say, you've misspelled donations. And then we have this long back and forth, which I'm so tired of, but at any rate, I just probably revealing way too much. I have all sorts of issues that I don't want to belabor the point on. So what is a dotation? A dotation is a gigantic cash payment deposited directly into the general's bank account for every month that the war went on. Now, there were also bonuses for special events. 50th or 60th birthday, 250,000 Reichsmarks. Maybe $2 to $3 million in today's money, maybe. It's, as you know, it's notorious. It was a large sum and seen as a large sum. I throw this up merely because just about the time Kluge was saying, I'm not a great man, you got the wrong guy, go find someone else to overthrow Hitler, he was getting $3 million stuck into his bank account for his 60th birthday. So just throwing that out there. I mean, money doesn't buy everything, but it often buys a lot of things, and it can buy a pretty high level of obedience and loyalty to the regime. Now, the generals, besides cash, which we all love, receive real estate. Large landed estates in the occupied territories, carved out of land seized from their rightful owners in Poland, let us say. And I hope no one has any question about where those rightful owners or the original owners were by now. They had been resettled, or they were dead, or they were in somewhere in a camp about to die. So I already said that Manstein was a skilled operator. He really knew his way around a map and understood strategy. There's some things you could say about Manstein. As late as October 1944, Manstein had agents in Eastern Europe, the parts that the Soviets had not yet reconquered, and he was having them scope out a suitable farm, big manor for himself after the war in Pomerania and points east. You could hear Soviet artillery shells detonating in the distance. I mean, that's how close the Red Army was. And Manstein thought, I was going to live out as a gentleman farmer on this estate once the war had ended. So he's not as smart as a lot of people give him credit for, is one thing I would say. I would point out, though, maybe there's a certain caginess here. He might have simply been trying to establish a property claim, and who knows how property claim, you never know how property claims are going to be adjudicated under some new occupation regime. So who knows exactly what he was thinking, but he was still looking for a farm, and so was Guderian. They were going to be gentlemen farmers on their manor farms for the post-war period, living out peaceful lives as heroes to the state on the fat bank accounts that Adolf Hitler had managed to create for them in the course of the war. So that's important too, and nobody should throw that one out. I've heard sometimes people, that can't. It's a lot of money involved, and I think we probably do need to look at it. So I think there's a fourth issue, though, and here's one I'd like to maybe emphasize. Maybe memory made them do it. Talk a lot about the history of memory today. We have to remember that these officers were the same men who had fought and lost World War I. They're not the same families. They're the same people, just like American officers are the same officers who fought and won World War I, likewise for the British. These are the same men who fought and lost the First World War. To a man, as a corporation maybe is a better way of putting it again, they believed it was because Germany had thrown in the towel too soon in that war. Due to rot on the home front, right? Socialists and pacifists and vegetarians and Jews and weak elements within the German domestic polity that had lost them the war. I think many of you probably heard this phrase in the room, the famous stab in the back theory, the notion that Germany hadn't lost World War I in some kind of fair and square military sense, but had been stabbed in the back. Now, with the German people, this time out was different. With the German people holding firm behind Hitler, there wasn't one of them, really, who wished to be the first to stand up and say, we've lost. See, if there was a stab in the back because of weakness on the home front, say what you will about World War II, that didn't happen. There was not a revolt on the home front. There was an attempted coup by some middle-grade officers to kill Hitler. But there was not a large-scale uprising as there had been that ended World War I. And I think that's stab in the back. So I think most German officers in 1944 and 1945 are looking at their 1918 calendar. I think they're in 1918. I think they're in the mindset of 1918. The mentalité, we might say. What are they really thinking? They're thinking, not this time. No stab in the back. We'll go down. We'll fight till 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after, fight till midnight, fight till 5 minutes after midnight, if that's what it takes this time around. And so they fought on. Now, interestingly enough, one thing that almost none of them claimed, and I think this is worth bringing into the discussion, is that they were afraid for their lives. Because I teach this stuff, and I've taught it for years, and that's what my students always say. You're worried Hitler was going to kill them if they disobeyed. But you know, in fact, Hitler had very few generals arrested in the course of this war, let alone killed. This is not Stalin we're dealing with, who had hundreds, perhaps thousands. And if we can say one thing about a typical German general in World War II, it's that he was absolutely unafraid of death. They tended to command from the front. Frontline reconnaissance, get right up there in the front lines, which is why so many of them were killed in the course of the war, killed in action. 676 German generals died in the course of World War II. It's a phenomenal number. It's a phenomenal number. So, what do we have? Fear, politics, money, memory. I think they were all in play in keeping the generals going in those last, especially horrible, let us say, 6 months. Let's just say 1945, the last 5 months of World War II. When they were all reeling back in retreat and their men were dying like flies in the tens and hundreds of thousands and millions. When one German town, village, and city after the other was being vaporized by superior military forces on both sides. And that I particularly call into play here American Airpower. The Germans might make a stand in some small village in Western Germany. It would be vaporized. And then it would happen again by U.S. Army Air Forces, and then it would happen again somewhere up the road. But there is one more unpleasant fact that I would like to bring into the discussion. Maybe some of them just felt like it. Maybe some of them just felt like fighting on, no matter what this overall situation at the front. And let me here enter into the discussion the case of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. There he is right in the middle. Ferdinand Schörner. Here we have a truly bad guy. Who was I talking to Katrine about, how despicable, what's the despicability rating of some of the people we're talking about? But here is off the chart. This is Mr. Herr Despicable. A truly bad guy, a fanatic, a National Socialist fanatic and a believer in Hitler, which for Schörner were probably one and the same thing. I don't know if you ever read all the party's 20-point policy statements, but belief in Hitler was National Socialism to Schörner. His signature move, if I mentioned Rommel and his sudden counter, Fingerspitzengefühl and Manstein's castling maneuver, he had a signature maneuver as well. And that was shooting thousands of his own men on trumped-up charges of cowardice late in the war in order to terrify the others into obedience. He liked to fly up to the front. The Germans have this little command airplane. They call it the Stork, the Fiesler Stork. And it could probably land in this room in a very short runway. He liked to fly up to headquarters kind of unannounced, do a brief inspection, and then hand down death sentences on the flimsiest of evidence. After the attempt on Hitler's life, on June 20th, 1944. For the next couple of months, Schörner would open his staff meetings by asking officers around the table, how many men did you hang today? On several occasions, he had dogs shot who were barking too loudly outside his command post. He once visited a repair shop where a crew was waiting to get their vehicle fixed and had the entire crew shot for malingering. He had 22 men shot near the end of the war for the crime of standing around without orders. You're driving down the street, and it appeared that the German soldiers, one of these units that had been dispersed by a superior Soviet attack, was probably looking for some command and control, and Schörner's idea of command and control was to have them shot. All of this took place at the very, very end of the war, with Germany collapsing in ruins all around him, and Hitler going so far, of course, as to kill himself. Even that didn't really free Schörner from what he felt was his obligation. The retreat path of his armies on the Eastern Front for the last couple months of the war was marked by thousands of German soldiers hung from lampposts on charges of cowardice with placards, attached around their neck detailing their offense. He was a maniac. He appalled many of his own colleagues. One fellow general, would be Dietl, who was the general in the Arctic. They're both Bavarians, which is how they knew one another. He once said, "Ferdy, who the hell do you think you are? A cop?" A cop in Nazi Germany is somebody constantly trying to root out ideological impurities. And here is Schörner being accused by one of his fellow officers. Now, just days before the end of the war, Schörner was commanding Army Group Center in Bohemia, what is today Czech Republic. The Germans were pretty consistent in the course of the war in the East. There was Army Group North, Center, and South. Sometimes South would be split up because of the size of the front, but they almost always reverted to the standard Army Group North, Central, and South. So here he's commanding Army Group Center in Bohemia, days before the end of the war. And he issued his last order of the day. For sheer distilled lunacy, I would like to read the entire thing to you word for word, but I'm standing between you and dinner. I realize that, so I'm just going to give you the money quote. "In these hard days," he said, "we must not lose our nerves or become cowards. Any man abandoning his post will be hanged." That's a little bit of inspirational talk from the general late in the days of a lost conflict. Now, a few days after that, however, Schörner got into his private aircraft, his Stork, and abandoned his post, flying off and leaving his men to their fate as Soviet POWs. I would say their uncertain fate, but we put another fate is pretty certain if you fall into the hands of the Red Army. This, war's still on. The war has not ended yet. Where does Schörner want to go? Who does he want to surrender to? Who do you surrender to? The Americans, of course. 3 square meals a day, and you're going to be fat and happy within 6 months. He reached the safety of U.S. lines in his aircraft. And what happened next? I rarely say this as a scholar, makes me proud to be an American. We handed him back to the Soviets. And they held him prisoner for the next 10 years. And he did time next to the very men that he'd left in the lurch. He often required an armed guard in Soviet captivity from his fellow Germans. I hope everyone understands the context I'm using here. He was freed in late 1954. West German rearmament had become the issue du jour, and the Soviets thought, what better way to humiliate the West Germans than freeing Schörner and sending him back to West Germany? So he was freed from Soviet captivity in 1954. He returned to West Germany to angry outbursts from many former soldiers and their families who had not forgotten the role that Schörner had played late in the war. He went on trial there too, and he spent 4 more years in prison. And I again, not that you. Sometimes you biograph someone and you kind of identify with them. Other times you develop an intense dislike. And I've really had a hard time trying not to develop an intense dislike for Schörner. I mean, that couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, in my opinion. He was in Munich, and apparently there was some deal whereby released German soldiers released from Soviet captivity could claim, free rides on the Munich metro. And he didn't get it. He wrote a very angry letter to the transport service saying, I'm a veteran like anybody else, and I deserve my free train ride. But he didn't get that either. Went to jail in West Germany. Now, certainly they were not all Schörners. In the course of the war, there's General Wilhelm von Seydlitz, one of the most famous names in the history of the Prussian and German army. I'll talk about him in a moment. But in the course of World War II, he broke openly with the Nazi regime, broke openly with Hitler after being taken prisoner at Stalingrad. He formed the League of German Officers, the Free Germany movement, the League of German Officers, which attempted to to drop propaganda leaflets on German soldiers at the front, telling them that this war had become senseless. No matter what was going to happen under Soviet occupation, it wasn't as bad as what was about to happen to Germany in the next year and a half, which I think we have to give some credit to. That's, to me, objectively true. General Count Schwerin, another very famous name in German and Prussian military history, once again, had an ancestor had served Frederick the Great quite loyally in the 7 Years' War. Schwerin refused to launch the men of his unit, the 116th Panzer Division, into a senseless attack at Mortain in August of 1944. He thought the orders would simply get the division killed, as they almost certainly would have in the teeth of U.S. firepower. He later tried to surrender the city of Aachen to the U.S. Army without permission from above. He was a brave and sensible man. He didn't see the point of getting Aachen vaporized again at the hands of U.S. firepower. He actually left a letter, this is kind of quirky, at the local post office, addressed to the American commander on the envelope. And it said, asking him to spare the town and the people unnecessary suffering. Now, this being the U.S. Army, the Americans halted just outside the city limits of Aachen, not wanting to get involved in too precipitously in a street battle. And the local Gauleiter returned to the city and found the letter at the post office and handed it over to the SS. And Schwerin got in some hot water, but not as much hot water as you might expect. He'd be commanding again before the war was over. Now, technically, I'm being a little ironic here. Technically, these men, the Seidlitzes and the Schwerins, were traitors and mutineers. I mean, that's what you call someone in the course of the war who switches sides or refuses orders. If you refuse orders in the Army by any military service, technically you're a mutineer. But I think, whether honorable men, maybe that's a bit much, but they're deserving of a certain honor, I think, by at least bucking the trend of senseless loyalty to Hitler. Nietzsche once wrote, and this phrase has always struck me, that the future would see, he said, a transvaluation of all values. Knaves would be regarded as heroes, and heroes would be unmasked as monsters. And perhaps the Third Reich really did realize Nietzsche's vision. Certainly in the career of these two. Now, Schwerins and Seidlitzes notwithstanding, unfortunately, let's go back to them and we'll end with Schörner was the prime example of the late war German general. He was loyal, all right, loyal to Hitler. And Hitler returned the favor, once calling him my favorite general, and specifying in his last will and testament that Schörner be the new commander-in-chief of the army. So he did. After Hitler shot himself, the war does not end immediately, and Schörner enjoyed several days as the commander-in-chief of the German army by appointment. Now, Hitler called him my favorite general. But I don't think it's unfair to expect generals to have another kind of loyalty. And that other kind of loyalty is to the men under their command. And there, Schörner failed miserably. So, let us end with the wit and wisdom, once again, of the dean of World War II historians, and I refer to Dr. Weinberg, who once described the end of the war in this way, the end of the war in Europe. Bribes for many at the top, bullets for thousands at the bottom. It was commanders like Schörner, in the end, who allowed it to happen. In fact, who made it happen. And so I'll end this talk with exactly where I began it. Hitler didn't do it all by himself. Thank you very much.
So we have time, about 10 minutes for questions, 10, 12 minutes. So, Rob?
Does this pull out, or is this?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. Am I on? Okay.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
We're talking about the assassination plot, the Valkyrie assassination.
Yes.
And you're talking about how many. I want to know how many generals are approached by the conspirators, and I mean, clearly, like they all turn them down, but at the same time, they all keep their mouths shut too.
Yeah.
And so, is loyalty the right word there? Because they're not wanting to actively join in the plot. But on the other hand, a word from any of them could have busted this entire thing open before the bomb ever had a chance.
But there were numerous plots. So the July 20th plot succeeded in blowing up a bomb in Hitler's headquarters in Rosenberg, East Prussia, today Kenshin in Poland. There were dozens of other plots, many of which were revealed before they happened, and some through bad luck. But no, you're making a good point. They did Hitler's will to the end of the war. Some of them did see the direction it was going. At the very least, they didn't turn in every last person who came to them with some word of the conspiracy. And of course, that was, so after there was this conspiracy in July 20th, the conspiracy that we're talking about, certainly, that's the excuse for so much of the repression against the officer corps, that somebody must have known about this. And under torture, Hitler was surprised at how many of them had heard and, didn't bother to say, gee, they're talking about killing you, man. They didn't do that. So perhaps I would still say they were loyal to Hitler because they did his bidding, but there's also a strong corporate solidarity amongst the German officer corps, dating back hundreds of years, in many cases, to the sort of the dim mists of Brandenburg Prussia, or the Great Elector, or especially the period of Frederick the Great. That one of the ways that the Schwerins and the Seidlitzes, one of the ways they bragged about their family's lineage is how many of their forebears had fought and been killed in the 7 Years' War. They still talked about this in the 1940s. I know for many of us, the 7 Years' War. It's a little quaint topic that, I as a historian, I know how important it is, but how important is it today is an open question. And so I think there's still issues that we could probably look there around of corporate solidarity within the officer corps, which we often heard had been eroded in the course of the war, but I really don't see it having been eroded until, I think one of the most important things the Allies did at the very end of the war was abolish Prussia. I know that sounds funny too, it's because there's the 7 Years' War and the original unification state, the seed of German unification, but it was also, I think, the seed of German militarism in a way that no other state could claim. And but certainly the Allies saw it that way. There's a certain Prussian nostalgia today. Preußen ist wieder chic, as Hansel Rebell wrote in the 1990s. Prussia's chic again. He wasn't happy about that. He was saying that ironically. But I think erasing those corporate bonds of solidarity amongst the German officer corps was probably necessary to make West Germany at least a truly modern West European state. So I think you're making a good point. I would still use the word loyal to the person. I see Vika first. That's the first person I saw. So.
But then I can catch you later.
So. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
You.
No, I was just.
I'm out of practice as a teacher. I did this for 30 years, and I'm a museum guy. So you.
No, I was just curious, going along with what you were just saying, how much would you attribute, the silence of the officer corps to time you're a general, you've been in service 20 plus years,
yeah.
And it's ingrained obedience and.
Yes, but it's ingrained obedience. But if I'm arguing that there's also this issue of corporate solidarity, hearing that the head of state is about to be assassinated, there's a kind of obedience. So, and you tell me that, and I say, okay, man, thanks for letting me know. But the next phone call I make is not to the head of state. And that's a kind of an interesting concept of loyalty as well. That's where I think corporate solidarity is also playing a role. Cameron? Yes.
So there's this, almost fetishization of the German army during World War II, and it gets a lot of coverage from not academics. And so I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is where do you see serious academic scholarly research heading as it regards the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces?
Well, I think where it has headed now for decades is to look at the Wehrmacht's role as an occupation force, as an atrocity generator, an atrocity committer, as an accomplice to the Shoah, as an accomplice to the Holocaust. I think a real break point for studies of the Wehrmacht was the Frankfurt Institute's exhibition called Crimes of the Wehrmacht, in which suddenly a photographic record was laid bare of many of the things that the Wehrmacht had done. So, what your father had done and what your grandfather had done, millions of Germans saw this exhibition. Some of what they saw was called into question, and it was inaccurate. Some of the victims you're looking at in the original exposition were murdered by the NKVD. We know this now, and so there were some mistakes. But so those were. Then there was a second edition of the same exposition that was put on public display, and it had been scrubbed of some of those mistakes. But I think the occasional mistake notwithstanding, that to me was a break point in the way we look at the Wehrmacht. So. Good operational history. Every now and then I hear, well, we got to, get beyond operational history. And, I'm 60 years old, but I'm not going to. So I love operational history. But I think I've tried to get to the sort of thought processes of the German officer corps. That's how I see my work being of value today. But good operational history, serious, archival based. David Stahl, Stahl, he's written 3 amazing books on Barbarossa, Typhoon, and Kiev. Three very, very fine books. Greg Lidke is a Canadian.
Yep.
Do you know Greg?
I do know.
I sat on Greg's Bible, his oral, his defense of his dissertation a few years back, and the book he published out of there is it looks at manpower levels of the Wehrmacht. The German claimed to be constantly outnumbered in every single battle they fought, often with conscious overtones of Thermopylae. It's always constantly talking about hordes. You know, Lidke has exploded that once and for all. The Germans had a lot of manpower in places, they just often used it ineptly. And so I think Greg Lidke is doing good work. I've talked it up to anyone who I can really think of. But right now, I'm interested in learning more about Wehrmacht occupation, some of the regions where we haven't heard much about it. Waitman Bjorn wrote a real fine book about Belarusia not too long ago, Marching in the Darkness, I think it was called, a few years ago. I read that, and I remember reading it in manuscript for the press and being really impressed with what he was doing. Grant Hayward just got a PhD at Texas A&M, and he's interested in Romania and Romanian collaboration with the Wehrmacht. And I think occupation collaborations regimes, there's so much to be said. I remember reading German occupation in Russia by Dallin, D-A-L-L-I, long ago. I was knee-high or grasshopper. It's a good book, and there's so much more documentation, literally archives with the documentation that are out now. And I think more remains to be done at that point. So, Ben Shepard's done good work on the Wehrmacht in the Balkans. This is fascinating. I love cultural military history. Shepard has identified the most brutal German generals in anti-partisan warfare in the Balkans, almost all of whom were former officers of the Austrian army. Isn't that fascinating? That's to me was a fascinating point. It may, I have not delved into all the primary sources, and who knows, there may be a counterblast someone's writing right now. But you know, you'd have absorbed that as a child, as an Austrian member of an Austrian military family, hatred of the Serbs. They started World War I, and then that horrible occupation fight in World War I, and now they were doing it again in World War II. So that's got all kinds of juicy operational details, but also has more than a bit about military culture. Con, I see you back there, yeah.
I just have to say, I've done a lot of work with the Bundeswehr.
Right.
And the Bundeswehr doesn't know what to do with the plotters, because they've taken a personal vow to Hitler. They didn't have a clause in their stuff about illegal orders.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to deal with these guys, because while they have now a system today like we do, where you disobey an illegal order.
Right.
For them, these guys violated their oaths.
No,
and something the Bundeswehr doesn't know how to deal with.
No, they don't.
Deal with these.
It's not, the Bundeswehr does not only, was that like a triple negative? The Bundeswehr has trouble dealing with this plot. The Bundeswehr has trouble dealing with the entire German military past. Exactly what do you do? Rommel seems to have clean hands. Well, not really. Loyal to, you couldn't find a more loyal officer than Rommel. His whole career depended upon currying Hitler's favor. So, Werner Mulders, the great fighter pilot. Maybe no. You could just knock down the pins one by one. So the memory wars, obviously, Germany's going to have memory wars of a particularly vicious sort. But I live in New Orleans, and outside my window at the museum is a pillar in what used to be called Lee's Circle, in which Robert E. Lee used to sit on top of it until a few months ago when the mayor of New Orleans decided it was time to take it down. There was kind of an op in the middle of the night, masked men taking down Robert E. Lee. So, we're in the midst of our own sort of very, very serious memory wars as well. But I doubt if anywhere they could be more vicious than they have been in Germany. So, Günter Grass, a great novelist, spent an entire lifetime, an entire public career, poking fun at these ex-Nazis and hinting that this guy's a Nazi. And just, that's what he did his whole life. He sort of exposed former Nazis. Then one day in the middle of an interview, he said, "Oh yeah, I was in the Hitler Youth. Of course I was. We all were. I was in the SS."
Yes, the book, what is it, the peeling of the onion.
Yes, the peeling of the onion. Which he said, yeah, we were all in it. We were all in it. And he had spent, and there a lot of people came out of the woodwork and said, "Oh my God, of all people to make this claim right now, I can't believe it." Grass had been one of those two, the New Left in Germany. He had been very critical of many members of the New Left. Hannes Herr, who's the professor who did the exposition of the crimes of the Wehrmacht, he came back with an interview and said, how do we really know what Grass was thinking back then? What do you think about the Holocaust? Grass was 15 or something at the time, so it's very hard to say he knew anything or like even if, whatever he thought about the Holocaust, he was a 15-year-old by definition, he was sort of juvenile. But the point being, memory wars in Germany are always going to be of a level of intensity that I think just won't be reached anywhere else. I mean, Russia was having memory wars, and now those seem to be tamped down under the new Putin regime. Maybe in private, the memory wars are still raging, but you sure don't hear them in public anymore. The rehabilitation of Stalin, of all people.
Well, we've been very successful in completely emasculating the Bundeswehr.
Yes, right. I don't. So the Bundeswehr now has internal leadership, innere Führung. You're supposed to, when they say do something bad, you're supposed to say no. But you know, that's a tough road to hoe, given how modern command and control works in a contemporary military institution. So it's going to be rough. If you can shove your hand up. I think we may be getting towards the end. Yeah.
Well, and I know Jonathan's been.
Okay, we got a couple then. But you first, because I know you're the first person I saw with your hand up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the limits of corporate solidarity here, because I think corporate solidarity is really important. It's hard for us to get our minds around in German context. But it's also true that Hitler had an officer girl, both because of the length of the prosecution of the war and just casualties, and because of his own personal policies that was less uniform than previous German officers. What about the Rommels and the Fundlings? What about the Catholics? What about the non-Prussians? Why does this corporate solidarity work as well as it does when it's arguably much more substantively diverse than the officer corps of the First World War?
I mean, because maybe diversity is kind of a false virtue in this case. I think there are certain virtues which are inculcated into you when you become an officer, and even if you've come up to speed very quickly in the German officer corps, you've probably heard, for example, if I may, let's get rid of Scharner here. No, wrong direction. You've heard the famous story of General Seydlitz. You know, General Seydlitz at the Battle of Zorndorf in 1758 against the Russians, Prussia versus Russia. And the Prussians are reeling in defeat. Their entire left wing has given way. And Seydlitz is the great cavalry commander, and he's assembling his cavalry charge. And Frederick the Great sends him a messenger saying, "Come on, man, get with it. It's time." And Seydlitz says, "No, not ready yet." And another message, and then a third one in which Frederick the Great says, "Look, if you don't launch this cavalry charge in the next 30 seconds, it's going to be your head." And Seydlitz's famous comment, memorized by every German officer in the course of the Second World War: "After the battle, my head is His Majesty's to do with as he wishes, but in the meantime, let me use it in his service." So these stories, I've spent most of my career sort of assembling what I think are the foundational myths of the German officer corps. And I think you're making a good point, but I would almost say that someone like Rommel, a kind of jumped up, ambitious non-Prussian in Prussian, now suddenly in Prussian service, that's hardly unusual. That describes half of Frederick the Great's officer corps. I'm thinking of Derflinger, the first great field marshal of the Prussian tradition. You know, was from wherever, he was from Sweden or something. He was not, and Blucher would be another one, but neither one of them was born in the heartland of Brandenburg. So I understand, and I think, you know, after the war, this was another excuse from a lot of the German generals. They said, well, we got watered down with all these, you know, jumped up logistics officers who were suddenly put in charge. You know, men whose names I had never heard before. I've read that in interrogations with German. I'd never even heard of them. As if that was, you know, that's a disqualifier for being in service in the Prussian army. So those individuals coming in, we could make a case that they were even more willing to sort of become as Prussian as anyone, or even more Prussian than the Prussians. I think, was there one more? I just want to make sure that everybody...
Yeah, there was Jonathan, and then we're going to have to continue the conversation.
One to add, the point you made about November 18, I think is central.
Yes.
So the remembrance of November 18, and I think it's Nick Stargard in the German War, where he talks about
Yes.
it on the civilian level. So it's
Right.
not just the military guys, but everybody has November 18 in the back of their mind.
Right.
And that does wonders to the, corporate solidarity.
There's the, I talked a lot about this in the current book, because it seems funny.
It's not really good.
Think about the planning for Operation Desert Storm within the U.S. military establishment. There's a particular conflict that got mentioned again and again and again and again in planning documents, and it wasn't even Operation Desert Storm, the war that was actually being fought. It was Vietnam. We're going to lick that Vietnam syndrome once and for all. This isn't going to be like Vietnam. And then in the post-war speech, George H.W. actually says that. We licked that Vietnam syndrome once and for all. He had no idea what was right around the corner, did he? And it's a big insurgency, and the rise to influence of Conrad Crane. He had no idea what he was facing in the near term.
Don't blame me. Don't blame me.
But it strikes me that's a pretty good analogy. What's an experience seared into collective psyche of the American officer corps in Vietnam, and it seemed that somehow I almost felt sorry for Saddam and the Iraqi army. You know, they were paying for the sins of the U.S. perceived sins of the U.S. Army to fail to bring the Vietnam War to a successful conclusion. So they had to kind of be exterminated. And
We should be a Dick Stargard as one of our keynotes, the London conference.
I've never met him. He's a genius. He's a great one.
Really, the two of them got two keynotes just so brilliant together.
Oh,
fantastic. So my question was around this coercion that starts to take place in the German army, and I wondered is that kind of theoretically based, or is it just because some are bastards and some are not? I mean, so think. They shot 20,000 of their own troops?
Oh yeah, well the number has varied depending on source, but let's say 20 to 25,000. So roughly the infantry strength of an army corps.
The Russians shoot what 200,000 of their own troops? That's what I think I read. British shoot 0.
Yes, and the Americans shoot what?
Yeah, but on 4 occasions, field commanders asked for the death penalty to reintroduce the British army.
Yes.
4 occasions. So they think it was a massive mistake because they can't put women and troops through the state. So was it theoretically based, was it more personality based?
I think it could be more personality based on how eager you were to curry favor with Hitler, or how deeply ingrained 1918 was in your psyche, or how much you hated communists, or how much of an anti-Semite you were. Johannes Hütte wrote a really good book called Hitler's Army Commanders, in which he talks about that at the very least there was a partial identification on the part of each high-ranking German officer, so General Corps we're talking about. At least it's a Teil Identität, so at least a partial identification with the aims and the means and methods of the regime. So, I think that what Hitler was offering in the 1930s was what the vast majority of German officers wished. They wished a big new military force that would allow them to rise. They wished for a war of revenge to erase the blot on the escutcheon of World War I. They wished for what they saw as the Jewish threat to be expunged from German life. Many of them were anti-Semites of what we call the genteel variety, but I'm always never quite sure where genteel ends and horrible begins. Country club anti-Semitism. But I think most German officers were a great deal more than country club anti-Semitism because they blamed Jews for the loss of World War I. Obviously it couldn't be our own fault. And so like Siegfried, there had to be some kind of treachery, some kind of, once again, stab in the back. So I think there's, this was a question, Jonathan, that we kind of dealt with earlier when one of the graduate students asked. How much personalism and how much structuralism? And I think there's always this is the great mojo of being a historian. This is what motivates us is these kind of discussions. Because I can look at German officers in World War II and say, well, that looks like a fairly honorable career path in really horrible times. But then I can look at others that people seem to love, like Rommel, and say, I have no idea what people are seeing in Rommel. So that's the juice of our profession, is that line between structuralism, I'm talking about a corporate body of German officers, and personalism, the fact that each of us is an individual with free will and makes our own arrangement with the National Socialist regime, or whatever regime happens to be in power.
Well, I'd like to thank Robert for